Welcome to the Working Audio Tools podcast, the home of all things audio, mixing and mastering, where we constructively compare and critique mixers and sometimes interview audio professionals from the YouTube and music industry worlds. This week we have a special guest who I've wanted to get on the show for a while, particularly in lieu of our recent transitions and developments in mine and Paul's studios, where we've been rabbit-holing room acoustics, speaker calibrations, mix translation, and all of those fun subjects that you guys have been listening intently to on our journey. First of all, though, I would like to just give a shout out to Hyphaman, who have kindly sent us these headphones. What are they, Paul?
Hyphaman, Jesus Christ. Hyphaman Sandara closed. Many of you will know that I used to use the Hyphaman Sandara openbacks when I first started the headphone journey. So I'm very good friends with Hyphaman, and now Ed is as well, as he's now got the Ananda Nanos. So we wanted to have a consistency, and they reached out and said, why don't you use the Hyphaman Sandara closed? And that's what we're wearing. And that's the only time I want to mention that. So but we've done that now. So thank you very much, Hyphaman. And let's go on to the rest of the episode.
Excellent. And in an ironic twist of fate, talking about closed back headphones, this has nothing to do with what we're going to talk about with our guest today.
We'll see.
Who is Jesco from Acoustics Insider. So we're going to be talking about room acoustics, speakers and treatment, and whatever else comes up as we dive in. Jesco, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you here. You have established yourself as the authority in acoustics on YouTube. How did you get into acoustics, and what's inspired the channel?
Well, so I started doing sound engineering mixing back in 2010, I believe. And I kind of did that professionally for about 10 years, mixing a lot of electronic music, mainly electronic dance music, a lot of house music, tech house, that sort of stuff, some hip hop. That kind of bridged into mixing a lot of like pop electronic music. During that process, obviously at some point I stumbled across the topic of acoustics, as you do once you start doing professional audio.
Yep.
And we did have a few seminars at university about acoustics. This is all very theoretical, but it's good that I did that, I guess. Laid some foundation there on that side. But yeah, so I got into the more practical side of just treating my studio and kind of trying to figure that out. And then people started asking me if I could do it for them. And that led to about 6 years of building and treating kind of project home studios here in Berlin. And back in 2016, 17, I basically realized that it was very difficult to grow beyond Berlin. People kept asking me out from literally the town across, kind of the next town over, could I come help them? And then very realistically, very quickly, I found out the budget isn't there. It's not possible. If I even if I have to just drive over to the next town for one day, spend a night there, all the logistics involved, double the price, and nobody's able to pay that in that particular niche. And so at some point it clicked and I realized, but what I can do is obviously teach people how to do this. This isn't something that I can do myself for a living because it's literally not possible from a budget perspective. But if I turn this whole thing into an online education business, then I can teach people and I can actually get the price down to where people are getting help, the help they need more than anything. And for me, it's still a viable business. And so that's when I basically transitioned or started Acoustics Insider. So at the time I was doing professional mixes, I was building studios here in Berlin, and I started Acoustics Insider. So doing the YouTube videos, working on kind of my first course, dealing with or like doing some consulting work and this sort of stuff. But it was just too much. There was just too much going on. At some point, a year after that, I realized I need to focus on just one thing. It took me about a year of making that decision to actually stop mixing professionally, because I love mixing. I still do. And to stop treating studios here in Berlin and focus purely on taking all that experience and that knowledge that I gained and putting it into Acoustics Insider and building a teaching platform. And so it's been a good 6 years now, and I've got a good flow going, I think. It's fun to do. It's obviously, as any kind of job, it's got its upsides, it's got its downsides. One major one being that I just don't I don't get clients for mixes anymore. Obviously, I stopped nurturing my clients and all that stuff, so it's kind of natural that it dried out.
Mixing for the people.
Yeah, basically, yeah. I still do some mixing for some friends, so obviously I still have some close friends who still are professional DJs, professional producers, and so every once in a while I mix for them. Very often I actually just hang out with them and then mix at their place. So it's not really that I still do some mixing work, but it's not in my studio anymore.
Okay.
So I'm still kind of I still get to train that or I get to still play that playground, if you will. But yeah, no, professionally, like taking on jobs as for mixing, I don't do that anymore.
So you've done the opposite of what Paul and I are trying to do. We're trying to ditch YouTube and become full-time mix engineers.
I mean,
fair play.
I totally get it. It's one of the, to me, it's one of the best jobs there is. I loved mixing. I still do. It's the kind of the greatest flow experience that I've definitely had.
So a lot of our audience, I think, are going to be shouting questions at us. So hopefully we can answer them for them. What's the most common mistake or problem you find in the average home studio?
It's funny because it's the most obvious and most frequent mistake is literally setting up your listening position and speakers in the wrong place in the room. I pound this to death on my channel because it is so important, and because if you know what you're doing, if you follow what I teach, it's not hard to do. But if you don't know the right approach and what you're looking for, it's actually pretty hard to do. Yeah. And you can kind of get it in the ballpark with a lot of experimentation. But if you don't know exactly what you're trying to do, what you're trying to achieve, it's pretty easy to, first of all, put your listening position in the wrong spot. And then you basically have bad bass. That's like the standard thing. Because the where you put your listening position is the defining factor for the low end that you end up with. And then setting up your speakers, like standard stereo triangle stuff. I think one of the reasons is that like people mess this up to the point where basically they don't get a proper stereo image. And without a proper stereo image, you can't judge obviously panning, but also space and also mid-range. And so if you don't have a proper stereo image, you literally cannot mix, period. Yeah. And a lot of people mess this up because they compromise on their speaker positioning because they want a huge-ass screen or two huge-ass screens, or their desk has built-in speaker platforms that don't actually work for their particular room. Totally. Yeah, and you just follow this is what the desk tells me, so I'm just going to put my speakers there. Turns out it doesn't work. Yeah. And so those are actually the most frequent mistakes that I see people make. And funnily enough, it's also the biggest fix. Usually when I help people just figure that out, it's just like, oh my God, where have you been all my life? And I'm just like, All
right. So this leads nicely to my next question, which has come about because my speaker journey recently and my mixed translation and room acoustics journey was leading me to believe that my desk was causing me problems.
Okay.
I then had someone come into the studio and very kindly help me demo 3 different sets of speakers. And one of them was a transmission line front-ported speaker.
Sure.
Brand you can probably guess.
Yes.
One of them was a passive speaker with rear-facing passive radiators.
Okay.
Brand you can probably guess.
Yes.
And the other one was a closed enclosure with lots of DSP doing lots of wonderful things.
Okay.
And the larger speaker was the enclosed box, and that had a big, 10-inch woofer on the front, 23 centimeters, I think it is, because it's the same size as my PSIs. And that had the same acoustic problems on the desk as my PSIs do. Then the transmission line, I didn't actually test because I tried them before and I knew they weren't right for me. And the other ones, the Amphions, 2 18s, and they instantly measured better in my room and on my desk by quite a considerable amount. I will probably do a video on this. I don't know why, other than maybe rear-facing passive radiators versus a front-ported larger woofer, whatever the reasoning, these are the speakers that measure better in my room. Do they sound better? They have different qualities. Do they translate better? My experience of this brand of speakers is 100%. So they are staying. But what's your experience of different speakers working and not working in a room? And is there a perfect speaker for every room?
That's a hard question. We could probably talk this entire podcast just about that question.
Let's do it.
People are just going to be like, oh, no.
Better than Atmos.
Yeah, that's true. Let's start with the last question first. Is there a perfect speaker for every room? There possibly is, but you won't find out through any other means than experimentation.
Yeah.
Sadly, yeah.
And the reason there possibly is because of how the speaker puts sound into the room, right? So we're talking about obviously the frequency range, but on top of that, dispersion, both in vertical and in horizontal planes, the horizontal and the vertical plane, right? Depending on how your room reacts to how the speaker puts sound into the room, it might react in a beneficial way. And so from that perspective, there might be a perfect speaker for your room, but you won't find out because you need to basically try them all until you find one. And then there's obviously the question of how do you say what is perfect, right? I mean, I'm putting quotation marks here for people just listening, because what is a perfect speaker? What does that mean?
Subjective. Yeah.
Perfect to do what?
I mean, there is no such thing as a perfect speaker because everything is a compromise at some point. But I think what really blew me away was the impact of having a larger woofer on the desk facing me and how acoustically that was causing problems, regardless of position further back, wider, narrower. Obviously, I can't experiment with the vertical height too much, which is the issue.
Did you have the Amphion set up in landscape, in portrait, or landscape?
So I've had the 115 set up horizontally, and they measure really well. I put them on the desk and they sounded awful. But then the 218s just miraculously seemed to sound great and not be affected by the room acoustics that other speakers are.
And you had those in portrait or landscape?
These are the big tall ones.
Yeah,
so these
so
are
you had them vertically.
In vertical position, yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to just give you an answer, or do you want me to guide you through it? So you know how it has two speakers, one on the top, like mid-range speakers, one on the top, or like mid-bass speakers, whatever they call them.
This is a theory I was about to investigate as and when time permitted.
And I really recommend you read through the reviews on Sound. One of the authors, I can't remember, one of them basically does really deep dives into both the technical aspects and how they measure as well. And he always explains the operating idea behind different speaker formats. So I'm going to try and summarize what he says basically. So basically with these two, they're playing the same thing. And through that, you can actually create an interference pattern because what comes out of these two speakers on top of each other, that will interfere at some point in between them, right? And that will actually narrow the dispersion in certain frequency ranges. And the typical thing with one of these vertical ones with one speaker at the top and one at the bottom, if they play the same thing, is that you get a very narrow vertical dispersion and at least reduced vertical, let's say like that. Reduced vertical dispersion. And that tends to put less energy both into the desk, potentially the floor, potentially the ceiling.
Right.
And so that's why they tend to measure better, because you're basically creating less, or there's less energy to reflect off of stuff like your desk and then mess up the measurement.
So if I'm right, and it's almost giving you better directivity. So it's not really, so it's not spreading about the room as much. It's more direct, which, that makes very, very easy, simple answer. Eh?
That is probably it.
Yeah.
But to be quite frank, you can't know. You just said that with the other ones, they measured really well as well, and those only have one mid-range speaker, if I'm correct.
Yeah,
right?
the 115s, yeah.
I've also seen plenty of other standard two-way and three-way speaker systems do this exact thing, as in not put too much energy into the desk. It is extremely variable between speakers. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder how much of it is woofer
yeah.
related, because the Ex Machinas I tried and the PSIs have large woofers, and they are subject to, particularly the PSIs, they're so subject to the room acoustics. They need Trinov. The Ex Machinas not so much, but the readings were still similar to the PSIs. So I wonder if in a room like mine, it is literally the larger the speaker, obviously the more omnipotent the bass becomes, and therefore causes itself more problems than smaller drivers that, as you've suggested, might be more directional.
Well, the funny thing is, right, bigger drivers, for example, like you can't distinguish a smaller from a bigger driver purely by looking at the frequency response.
Sure.
Right? There are small diameter drivers that push just as much low end as a bigger diameter driver. Yeah. So it's not
true.
It's not a frequency thing.
Is it an energy thing?
So yeah, but energy in relation to what, right? So a larger woofer, a larger surface area moves more air. So there's something going on there. It's I mean, we're already getting into kind of the threshold of where, and definitely my knowledge, but from what I'm hearing from other people, like speaker designers as well, kind of the science somewhat stops, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of things we can measure, but for some reason we can't measure if a speaker sounds good.
DistroKid sponsor the Working Audio Tools podcast, and you can get 30% off your first year's subscription using the VIP link in the YouTube video description and podcast show notes. DistroKid makes distribution of your music easy with unlimited uploads, and you get to keep 100% of your royalties and earnings. Join over 1 million artists who rely on DistroKid to get their music into Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube Music, TikTok, Tidal, Instagram, and all other streaming platforms now and in the future. The new DistroKid app is available on iOS. Go and download it from the App Store now. From here, you can upload new releases. You can see your DistroKid earnings and withdraw these earnings. You can view and share your hyperfollow links. You can check your streaming statistics from Spotify and Apple, and even add and edit lyrics and song titles. So keep track of your releases on the move with the new DistroKid app, available on iOS. Download it from the App Store now.
Now, this brings me on to a very important question. I've got down this kind of rabbit hole just now of the whole... I was doing an ARC, IK Multimedia and SonarWorks comparison, and what I found is that with my Atmos room, flat is never, ever, ever something that you actually want in a realistic room. And in my head, and from what I've been reading, that flat is really only for an anechoic chamber, where what I've learned is that as much as something can measure flat in, say, like a studio or acoustically treated room, that because you've got the interaction with the reflections in the room, and then you've got, different interference that's interacting with that room, that something can measure flat and say Room EQ Wizard, but just because it measures flat doesn't mean that it is you can say that it's equivalent to flat in an anechoic chamber. So just because something measures flat, especially in the top end for me, I find that the Calis in my Atmos room, even though they measure flat in Room EQ Wizard, I still find I'm using a room contour. So I'll normally say stick a 2 dB high shelf in a cut. Maybe a 2 dB cut, and maybe start at around 4 kilohertz. And
Isn't that a personal preference thing, though?
Well, that's the getting into the thing. But many people always have told me that
because you're very sensitive to top end, aren't you?
I am.
Like, this is why you hate the PSIs.
But if we kind of think about, if you think about Harman, yeah. But if you think about Harman, right, and we think about obviously Harman's, you obviously got your low boost, then you've got like your high cut. And many people have told me over the years that flat isn't actually what's realistic. Like in normal rooms, due to interference and the reflections coming in, you'll normally find that you've got a bit of a bass boost. And instead of it looking like that, it kind of looks like low, and then it kind of cuts off in the highs. So I suppose like the question would be, is that do you think that sometimes we waste too much time looking at how flat and how things measure? In many cases, what you see visually doesn't really correlate to the room all the time.
Very much so. There's a lot to unpack here. Let me just, first of all, throw this out there. SonarWorks does not give you a post-correction measurement.
Correct. Correct.
It gives you a post-correction simulation
Yep.
that is flat. If you measure that same corrected response, for example, with Room EQ Wizard, it is far from flat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True.
Which brings me to my first point. Flat doesn't exist in room acoustics.
Correct.
Yeah.
Totally.
Literally, this whole idea of a flat frequency response comes from electronics, converters and these things, where we want as little impact basically on the frequency response as possible. But rooms are not electronics. And we do measure the frequency response, but the goal and the not just the goal, but there is no possibility of getting a flat frequency response unless, like you said, you measure in an anechoic chamber and your speaker is actually perfectly flat, which none of them are, right? So that's the first thing. Flat doesn't exist in room acoustics. As soon as you put even any type of furniture in a room, it'll mess it up because of reflections and it's going to be all over the place. Then, so that aside, there's the taste question.
Yeah.
So what we like to hear is one thing. What actually works from a presentation perspective as a translation tool is again another thing. That's one of the things that a lot of people get confused when they're talking about professional audio and hi-fi, basically home listening, because a lot of the tests in psychoacoustics and what we like to hear are literally that, tests of what we enjoy listening to. But enjoyment is not the same as saying, does this allow me to mix in a way that translates more easily?
Yep, ladies and gentlemen, that is season 7 in a nutshell. It's a wrap. It's been emotional. Thanks for coming and solving that for us. Literally nailed it on the head.
Yeah?
That is just that one key piece of information I think everyone needs to understand when fitting out a room, buying speakers and starting to mix. And you've just summarized in 30 seconds there what has taken Paul and I 2 years to figure out.
It took me some years to figure that out as well. So, that same thing of, well, let's move on. Doesn't matter. What else to say? What translates well is very subjective as well, because it depends on your taste. Some people prefer more bass, some prefer less bass, some like to hear more high end, some like less high end. That's why I don't, or rather, I recommend that people do the last step in toning
100%.
their system. That's what the PA people call when they when they actually tune their system to taste. Tuning, they say, is a technical thing, is like getting the system to perform optimally is tuning from a technical perspective. And then on top of that, you tone it to your taste. And this toning thing, where you basically boost bass or high end to your liking, or cut, if you will, that's just a taste thing. You just do that by ear. And the way that I recommend that you do this is that you pay attention to the mistakes that you're making while mixing.
Yeah,
because you will naturally gravitate towards a certain tonality in your system. And if your system doesn't have enough bass, you will always put in, wait, how does it go? So it doesn't have enough bass, so you'll boost it more. So you always put in too much bass, right?
Yeah.
If your system has too much treble for your liking, you will always put in too little treble for the actual, for your taste or your mixing, what you like, what you'd like it to sound like. So if you find yourself over the period of a month or two doing a few mixes and they always show the same mistakes in the amount of bass and treble that you're putting in, that is a sign that your system might not be toned to your particular taste. And then you need to just boost the bass a bit or boost the treble a bit and see if that solves the problem.
Yeah, because what I found with me, we've always said it, is that I am very susceptible to high frequencies. So, when I did the SonarWorks thing and I first tried it out, I remember my mixes were coming out very dull because I was tuning everything down. And then when I was in the Atmos room, again, because I've got 12 speakers, 7.1.4, you imagine I've got them all set to flat and I've got to use SonarWorks because of the multi-channel tuning calibration is all that I've got access to. So obviously they were all kind of being tuned to their house curve. And it was just 12 speakers, all really bright, and it was affecting the localization. And honestly, just that 2 dB cut in that shelf at 4 kilohertz, I was just like, wow, everything all of a sudden sounded way better. And I was like, I could hear the localization better. I wasn't being distracted by the top end. And it was just night and day. And I find when I do that in Arc 4 has got certain contours. And so that's what I try and say to people, that flat is pointless, because if you look at what they class as a room control contour, it's like a bass lift with like a high cut. But again, Ed might come into my room, with him being a drummer and his ears being battered over the years. He might come and go, fucking Paul, lift the top end a bit. You know what I mean? So you're right.
My cymbals.
Yeah. But I think that's probably the best thing that I think you mentioned there, was using the two different words, tuned and toned. I think that's really the best way to look at that. There's tuning and then there's a tonal aspect. And that, I think when you separate those two, I think that's when it makes most sense for people. Because I think people do tend to get overly technical. Like me and Ed have been there, and I know you would have been there, where as soon as you get a room EQ wizard, it is the devil. It is the absolute devil. Because you start looking at waterfall plots, you start looking at decay times, and before you know it, you're measuring, you're moving inch by inch. You're like, oh, the decay time improved there. Oh, but it wasn't that great in the low end. And then you focus on the null, and then it's a compromise. And you can run yourself daft. And that's what I love about your videos, is that you mention that quite a lot, that, look, perfect does not exist, and there's no point striving for perfection. You've just got to get it sounding as good as you can and accept it. And once you accept it, then you can move on. But has there been anything for you that you've been surprised at? Now, you don't have to mention this certain studios, but say like big studios that you've been in or you've had a look at, that, you know, are big professional studios. Are there any kind of trends that you've been very surprised with, when you've been like, wow, like I wouldn't actually advise that, but many people would come in and go, this is how I want my control room to be like? Is there any things that, like certain things that you've been like, that's a bit of a trend, I wouldn't do that, I'm surprised that you do that? Has there any been common things you've been very surprised with?
Yeah, so first of all, I got to say, I haven't been in too many big studios. I've been in some, but not that many. I've definitely seen and heard from people working out of bigger studios and who come to me for help. And the thing is, studio design is such a custom job.
Oh yeah,
there is no standard. Even though we'd like to believe it, there is no real standard in control room and standard and just studio design. Every studio designer basically does a custom job. And so no studio is alike, unless they're from the same designer and they're basically built within the last 2 years, or within 2 years of each other, let's say. Otherwise, none of them are exactly alike. And so there's surprising things in all of them. I would say the most surprising thing I've seen is just the amount of mistakes that are, or basic mistakes that are still made, right? Again, setting up speakers, as simple as that. People seem to like beat themselves into working on a system where all they have to do is move the speakers a bit and their whole life will be 10 times easier, you know?
Yeah.
Or just the fact that a lot of studios look very pretty, but the acoustic response is absolutely terrible. And I think one of the reasons why we don't see a lot of measurements from professional studios is because they suck. They're terrible.
You've said that to me many times, haven't you? Many times.
And there's a lot of like voodoo and secrecy going on, and people don't want to admit the reality of how it is. I think that's one of the reasons people come to me, because I'm just like, look, this is how it is. Yeah, I'm not going to beat around the bush. It doesn't change anything. It's always been like this. Nothing's changed just because I'm saying that. And the fact is also, we're still able to mix perfectly fine. Yeah, and when we're, I think one of the things, coming back to what you were saying before, one of the things that is crucial for you to be successful with the sound in your studio is that you don't want to chase technical perfection. You want to chase translation potential.
That's the key.
Right? Let's say it like that, right? You want to optimize your sound to make your mixing as easy as possible. And the acoustics is one side of that. but there are basically a few fundamental things that you can tweak to optimize how well things translate, and that's what you should be chasing, right?
Because I think there was a great episode I remember you made where I think it was talking about over treatment, and it is absolutely true that, like, you would probably, if you looked at my Atmos room, you'd go, Paul, you've just basically went Rockwell daft and like big 2x1 panels, and it's broadband absorption everywhere, DIY stuff. And it's absolutely true that the way that rooms work, many times there's certain parts of the room that you need to focus on, and there's times where you've said, I could stick a panel over there, but it's not actually going to make any big difference. The best kind of advice I think I got from one of your episodes was that, and it was talking about you've got to learn the areas of the room that are the most problematic, and when you deal with those areas, at that point you'll then be able to accept things. But it is easy, there's parts of this room where I sit there and think, I could do this and that, and there's glass panels there, and is the curtains going to be enough to do that? Or maybe I should put a gobo at the side here for the first early reflection. And before you know it, you essentially just want to cover the entire room in Rockwell, when you're just like, you know what, I don't need to do that. And even your room's quite an interesting room where, it isn't what some people would assume, but it would just be like head to toe panels. You could tell that everything is very, very selective in your room, and right, okay, this is actually the places where I need to treat. And that's something that I think is very important. So in terms of your room, I mean, has it been a bit of a labour of love, or has it been kind of a experimental thing for you where you use your room as a way of kind of learning a lot about, the acoustic side of it?
So I used to experiment a lot in my room, and then I kind of got it up to the point where I didn't need to do any more experimentation, because my work I was down to like doing a mix in like 3-4 hours.
Didn't need to, or you'd given up?
No, I didn't need to.
Okay.
There's still certain issues that I'd like to at some point, if I ever have the time, to experiment with, and just for fun, as the challenge of figuring it out. And we're talking about, just like with any room, we're talking about basically treating 20 to 40 hertz.
Yeah.
That part of my room isn't particularly controlled, and I'd very much like to put in the time and develop a type of treatment that attacks that takes care of that. But at the same time, the thing is, like, I'm always thinking very functionally as well. Like, all my experimentation is always with the purpose of, can I then teach somebody else to do this?
Yeah.
And so I'm not going to go in there and build a whole bunch of membrane absorbers,
Helmholtz resonators and stuff.
Yeah, because it would be a resonator type of absorption, because you need it to be that type of absorption for.
Can I tell my audience to sit in a 1 meter deep room because there's 3 meters of bass absorption behind me?
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so basically, long story short, I stopped making changes at some point, just because I didn't need to anymore, and
so
I was focused
more.
On
abandon the project.
Yes, I abandoned the project. Please shoot me. Yes.
But at the end of the day, I think that is what I think many people need to hear, is that there is, we talk about a lot on this, on this podcast, that you can get to a point where it's all about making, the biggest changes. And then when you get to a point, like when we talk about analog gear, and, when you're talking about the conversion stages and stuff, you're talking infinitesimal results. And you get to a certain point where, to get the results that you need, you have to make such expensive changes. Like, again, if you want to fix the bass in your room, and your room's a certain size, you're going to have to find a way of extending that room, because at the end of the day, with the wavelengths of low end being so long, it's like, if your room's not big enough, then to trap the bass, you need to have, depending on the size of the room, you're going to need to have a lot of bass absorption to be able to tackle it. And if your room doesn't have it, then there's nothing you could do. As you said, you'd need to then start thinking about the route of resonators and stuff like that. But I find it interesting when people do comment about the speaker journeys that me and Ed are on, because everybody does bring it back to the room. And I do give them, credit to say that they are right. But I still believe that you could have a theoretically great tuned room, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's, the reason what makes a speaker sound good or bad, because it is all about taste. Me and Ed aren't a big fan of the Neumann KH310s. You will find people.
I don't like them.
Yep, you will find people online that will chastise you, that will find you, they will find your address, they'll put anthrax through your door, they will be like, no, you cannot do that.
Is that why you're Ginger Paul?
Yeah. I was just, people found me and turned me ginger,
Yeah, but it's funny. I'm in the same club. I don't like the KH310s. Never have. I don't know.
And that's the thing where it's like because the first time when Ed was talking about Neumanns, many people were like, oh, well, it's because of your room. That's why you don't like the speakers. That's why they're not performing, right?
Some guy told me to get a job in McDonald's if I couldn't mix on Neumanns.
Well, that's once again, what a stupid comment. Yeah. Just that the fact that you don't like a speaker doesn't mean that you can't mix on them. Again, we're talking, this is the difference between taste and translation mixability. It's not the same thing. You can mix perfectly well on a speaker that you absolutely detest, right?
Yeah.
Potentially. Doesn't mean you're going to enjoy the process, but you could probably do it.
Yeah, and you've got to enjoy it because you're spending a lot of hours on your own working on those things. I think ultimately what Paul and I have realized is that this search for perfect acoustics, perfect speakers, perfect speaker positioning, ultimately you get to a point where it's all a distraction from doing what we're supposed to be doing, which is mixing.
That's right.
And every time I think, I could improve that, I know that's going to be a day because it's never just, an out and move a speaker and then remeasure with Trinovitz. No, this is a day's gone by, a week's gone past. Have you mixed this week? No. Why not? Right.
Well, look, let me say this, right? Just like with any tool, because the room and the acoustics is a tool that helps you mix. And just like with any tool, the higher your skill level, the better your ability to discern differences and actually based on, or like the further you've developed your skill and your taste, the higher the demand on the tool is to give you feedback to allow you to exercise that skill. And so that's why people still build extremely high-end rooms. Just talk about the Northwood rooms built for Sterling Sound in New York, I believe, right? I mean, these are 6 extremely high-end rooms that must have cost I don't know how much because they basically master the highest of the high end of music. And the guys working there and the gals, they probably have the ability to use that tool to their full potential. And then it makes sense to spend that much on a room like that and to actually get the acoustics up to that level because you want the Stradivarius. What's that violin called? Stradivarius.
Yeah, right?
You want the most capable and most beautiful instrument to play. Yeah, and that's totally fine. And not just fine, that's great. That's what allows these people to really follow their craft at that high level.
It's a fine balance, isn't it? I think that's what we found is that you can't. I find it funny when people say, "Yeah, it's like it's all a distraction and you don't need to do any treatment." No, like we are telling you, you need to do. Like, don't ever get lazy and think that I could get a bass trap in there, but I'll just leave it. No, like you need to sort your room if you want to get to that point. As Jesco just said, with Sterling Sound, you're going to have to invest more money than you've ever had in your life because that's what you need. You need to invest so much in about room design. And I mean, that's why, we had Nicholas from Panorama Mastering on the podcast and he's building a house and, he was actually able to get the dimensions of the room before putting it in. But even when Ed was talking to a designer in a Gearfest and we were talking about, is there like suitable room heights? And what was it he said to you, Ed, if you were to have, and what most people would say, if you had a choice of a room height, that's what you would want. Can't remember what it was.
He said 8 meters long by 5 meters wide and 4 meters high. And obviously just to caveat, that's like ideal in a realistic sense with the ability of building in. So that 4 meter ceiling comes down to 2.5 meters and that 8 meter deep room comes down to about 5 meters.
Let me just say, because people shouldn't expect, talking about what we just said, people shouldn't expect that they need to invest this much in their room acoustics, right? The thing to realize is it's a tool, it grows with you. Your skill develops, your demand on your room develops, grows, and so your room and the amount of effort you put into the acoustics grows as your skill grows, and it just kind of goes like that. So that's how it works. You don't need the best of the best when you're starting out, but it helps to have some treatment, right? And most people do better with some treatment in the room. But to get to the question about the room size, so the basically bass frequencies and standing waves forming between the floor and the ceiling. And if you think, let's think about this flipped on its side. The room mode between the left and right walls, when half a wavelength fits in between your left and right walls, you'll have a null right in the center of the room. And you need to sit in the center in order to put up your speaker symmetrically to get a good stereo image. So there's a compromise there that we all make when we set up in the center of our rooms. The same thing potentially happens when you, in terms of the height of the room, right? So if usually people sit with their ears at somewhere between 1.20 meters and 1.30 meters when they're in their chairs. Usually it's about 1.22, 1.25, something like that. Yeah. And so if your room is exactly twice that high, then your ears will be in the center of the room from a floor to ceiling perspective. Yeah. And so then you're faced with the same issue as with the left and right room mode. And so if you raise the ceiling up, you can actually move that null above your head. And not just that, you can actually put your head in the section, in the part of the room mode where you get the correct amount of energy from that room mode. Yeah, so that's kind of the idea. And that's roughly somewhere about 4 meters.
And that was one key potential persuasion of me swapping desks, because the desk I had in mind was about 30 centimeters lower. So I could have sat 30 centimeters lower, which actually, now I think about it, would have put me right in the middle. Ignore that. That's a load of rubbish, because my ceiling is low. It's 2.1 meters. And I sit at 1.30 meters. So I'm above the center of the room by 25 centimeters. So if I lowered the desk by 30, I'd actually only be out by 5 centimeters. So maybe I'd have a different null. But you make a good point that speaker positioning is great, but then listening position, as you've said, this is something I've realized. Where I sit, where I measure the room, there is a null at 100 hertz, whether that be the side reflections interfering the ceiling to floor or the back of the wall, we'll never know. But if I move,
it will remain a mystery until the end of time.
Yeah, but if I move to, I think I'm at 33% of the way down the room. If I've tried 38, it's worse. If I'm, closer to the front wall where the speakers are, it measures considerably better. So it's getting to know your room, which is very, very difficult, and it takes time.
Or you hop on my free The Phantom Speaker Test mini course, and I guide you through it step by step, and you can get it done in about half a day.
Excellent plug. Free to all listeners of this. No, I'm joking.
It is free. It's free to everybody.
Right, okay.
It is actually free.
We're used to having Americans on selling stuff.
I'm also selling stuff that will come afterwards.
Okay. We'll put a link to that in the description, because I think that would be very useful.
It's basically a listening test, right? Because the idea with the listening position is to find that spot in the room where those room modes balance out as best as possible. And there is no objective perfect here. You're just trying to find the best of your options. And I call those spots the low-end sweet spots, right? So you're trying to find your room's low-end sweet spot where those room modes balance out, and that's where you want to place your listening position. And the easiest way to do that, to find that spot, is to actually excite all those room modes, get them all buzzing so you can hear them properly, and then you just move through the room while listening to some music, and they're all buzzing basically, and you can then tell where the low end is roughly balanced. And the way to do that is to put the speaker on the floor in a corner. That way you isolate the room mode issue from all the other potential acoustic problems. You reduce it to room modes. You can then hear them all, and then you can just sit in your chair, in your studio chair, and then you roll back and forth and listen to some music, and you can actually tell how those room modes affect the balance in the low end, and that's how you can hone in on the right spot, the low end sweet spot, fairly quickly. And this can be somewhat tricky to do if your room is very, very reverberant, or if and then you can just put some panels, like just put them somewhere. It doesn't really matter, just to get the reverb time down. That can help. Sometimes some rooms are very leaky, and so a lot of bass escapes, and then you actually don't get room modes building properly, like getting excited properly, and then you can move through the room and you don't hear a difference, and that can at first seem really daunting and seem really difficult, but that actually gives you the liberty to set up more or less where you want. That happens.
It does happen. That happened in my old studio. So when I started YouTube, I did it in my bedroom, and everyone used to be amazed when they came round because I made it look like a professional studio, but it was literally the camera was next to my bed, and it tucked away and it looked good. But acoustically, that room measured better than this purpose-built studio because behind the speakers, there was a great big window going across the length of the room. So all the low end was going out and wasn't reverberating inside and building up. And, just some foam tiles, I use the F word.
Yeah, come on.
Treated everything above 2K and resolved all the flutter echo issues. So
and that was probably it, right?
Yeah, and I did better mixes in there than I did when I first came in here, which was horribly concerning.
I'm sure.
Foam is such a dirty word, isn't it? It's something that...
I love it. The F word. I love it.
There's so much snobbery towards it, but it is useful for flutter echo. And if that's all you've got, it's better than nothing.
It's acoustic foam. It's made to absorb sound. It's the perfect tool. The problem is it's too thin.
It's going to do nothing below 2 kilohertz, but don't worry about that.
But if you can buy acoustic foam in greater depths, it'll work fantastic.
Density,
yeah. The problem isn't the foam, the material. The problem is that it's sold in a useless product shape, basically.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. DistroKid hosts a range of visually engaging social media promotion tools to help your release stand out from the crowd. Creative and colorful social media cards incorporate your artwork to help your release stand out. These are free to download and can be highly effective promoting your release. DistroKid also offer mini videos, which are free, short, customizable videos incorporating your artwork and a short clip of your track. And if this wasn't enough, DistroKid also have a tool to create a Spotify canvas generator, which is the video that plays in the background when you're playing a song on Spotify. Simply choose a theme and choose from dozens of different creative artwork concepts. These are free to use and great for engaging your audience, available on DistroKid. For an additional subscription of $8.25 a month, you can get your music videos distributed to Apple Music, Vivo, and Tidal, and you'll keep 100% of your royalties. With DistroVid from DistroKid.
Now, see, in terms of low end, now I know that, again, there's a PDF that I remember I downloaded ages ago.
The bass hunter technique. That's what I just explained. Yeah. So you can get that on, there's a separate link for that. You can just get the PDF. Or you can sign up to the video workshop, and it's all in there in video. Basically, I updated what was in the PDF. That was like the first thing that I ever kind of put out. And so I updated that with a whole bunch of questions that came in the years after. And so if you kind of want the revised version that's a bit more useful and a bit more to the point, then you just sign up to the free workshop and it's in there.
So one thing I would love to ask you is, now me and Ed have both got subs. So the great thing about subs, obviously, is that you can localize the low end. If you, in my Atmos room, well, to a certain point, so I'll explain. So in my Atmos room, I've got the bass management on all of them. So I've got it set to 150 hertz, and that's really what I found measures the best, but also sounds the best as well. But I found that by setting the sub in a certain place, I found that I was able to get it to measure, without, a big massive null in there. Which I find is quite good for Atmos wise. But many people were talking to me about the time alignment of the sub and speakers. And I think that's something that people forget, is that I talk about phase coherence quite a lot. And I always find that phase coherence is something that I desire now. As soon as I hear a speaker that has good phase coherence, I'm like, that's what I want to mix on. How do you get to a point where you've got a sub measuring well in the room, but you've got everything phase coherent? Is it a thing where you've got to, is it advised that when you have the sub in line with the speakers, or can you genuinely just place a sub wherever it measures best?
It can be hard.
Yeah.
especially if you don't have a sub and speakers from the same manufacturer. The main issue is that in order to properly align a sub to your speakers, or the other way around, whatever, you need to be able to adjust the delay of your speaker. Professional subwoofers, by default, do not have a delay option.
Yeah.
And so you literally cannot align them properly.
Yeah.
Which is just stupid. I don't know. It's an oversight in the industry. It's starting to change.
Is that because they're assuming you're going to use, if you've got that much of a high-end system, you're going to be using a room correction computer that's going to calibrate and do all the time alignment for you, such as Trinov?
I don't think so, because Trinov has been around for a while, but this wasn't the case before either, right? Even when these digital calibration systems weren't so widespread. So this is literally just an oversight. It's an oversight in the industry. I explain it otherwise. People just didn't understand what the fuck they were doing, basically, on that front. But the what you basically want to do is, ideally, unless you're in a perfectly treated room, what you want to do is find the spot in the room that gives you the best frequency response for your sub, then time align it to your speakers. For that, obviously, you need a delay knob. You need a time knob on your sub, and most of them don't have it, and so you literally can't do it. And so what you need to do in order to compensate for not having that control is move it closer or further away from your listening position, because that has the same effect. It basically introduces more or less delay.
Yeah.
And so the game with a standard sub that doesn't have a proper delay setting is the game that you're playing is moving it closer and further away from your listening position while measuring the frequency response.
Yeah.
And then finding the spot where you get the right timing and the right frequency response. Yeah. And that is, without measurements, it is literally impossible.
Yeah, 100%.
I'm postulating a listening test that might be able to do that, but it's been on my mind for years and it hasn't properly developed yet. At the moment, the only way to do that is with measurements. And even with measurements, you really have to know what you're doing, because it is very easy to get lost. So the easiest thing to do is to buy the sub that is supposed to match with your speakers, and then follow the setup instructions in the sub manual to the T, and then they will hopefully be properly time aligned.
That's actually something, Ed, why do people not speak about this? Like, that's the first time I've ever thought about that's why you would get the matching sub with the speaker.
No,
but again,
it's the same with live. It's the same with live sound systems. I don't speak about it because I've already known it for a while, Paul, if I'm honest.
Yeah, so live sound systems, and they've been doing this for ages.
Yeah.
They have proper speaker management systems where you can actually set the delay of every single attached speaker so you can get the alignment right. And that's how I know this. I mean, I studied sound system design in order to understand this properly. You know?
Yeah, and if you've got a subwoofer with a speaker pole going to a same brand top speaker, they've been designed so the wavefront hits you at the same time. So if you do misalign the brands, that might be off, and the crossover might be at different points. And
and unfortunately, you can't even with studio speakers, you can't even rely on getting your front grills matched or the fronts of your speakers matched, because
unless you get Augsburgers, but they're basically shouty PA speakers anyway. So
but so that's the thing. Like you need to actually follow the guidelines in the manual for the subwoofer, because they might have it designed in a way, set up in a way that it's supposed to sit slightly in front of your speaker, slightly closer to your listening position than your speaker, and that's when they're time aligned. It's messy. It's very messy.
Because I'm very fortunate because I've got Aurea, because I've got a relationship with them. So when I was building the Atmos room, they said, right, we've got all the parameters in there. So on every channel, you've got delay, you've got gain, you've got blah, blah, blah. So you can EQ manually and delay. Yep. So in SonarWorks, I think SonarWorks says they use phase measurements. And then, so when I'm done, I have the base management on specifically just so the time alignment is correct. But I'll notice that the LFE is always way more delayed than anything else. Like you might maybe find a couple of milliseconds for maybe the rears and sides, but the sub is always delayed quite a lot. And I was just sitting there thinking, Yeah, and I was just sitting there thinking, see if I didn't have this, how the hell would I figure out like that was the delay that would, and I don't even know if it's like SonarWorks is really that correct, the multi-channel version of it. But it sounds fine, but I was just sitting there thinking I better ask, because if I didn't have that, how would I do that? How would I even know, one, I had to time align the sub to the rest of them because there is a bit of a delay. And how would you go about doing that? And it baffles me why we don't speak about it as much.
Basically, Atmos exists because Audient invented Audio. So,
to me, it's a lifesaver. Jesus, absolute lifesaver.
And RME has actually added a both equalization and delay system to their latest, what's it called? Patch mix? Is that what it's called?
Yeah.
No. Total mix.
It's a total mix.
Yeah, total mix. Yeah. So
watch
now,
this space on that front as well.
love RME. Oh, Jesus Christ.
If I could afford it, I'd go RME. I really would.
So good.
So in terms of speakers, what is Jesco speakers? What is your taste?
I like air motion transformers. So
so talking head, Adam
audio, and Eve and all that. Yeah. So I love those. I mean, to be frank, probably the only reason I do is because I started mixing on Adams. I mixed my entire career. I mixed on Adams, and then I swapped over to heads just because I thought they were cool. And whenever I listen to Adams, like new Adams or heads or whatever, that's where I find my taste.
Is it the Type 20s you've got?
Yeah, I got the Type 20s, yeah.
Do you have them plugged or ported?
I have them ported, yeah.
Yeah, I preferred them like that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And with the linearizer on?
Yeah, the linearizer is game changer.
Yeah,
it's a way to say that, totally. Because I'm waiting on my set. Ed's got his set.
Oh, really?
I'm waiting on, Head, and we know a contact at Head, and he's sending me a pair to
sweet.
listen to. And it was one of those things where I really wanted a good proper three-way system in there. But as soon as I seen the linearizer, I was like, yes, this is exactly what. Because again, talking about phase coherence.
Yes, that's right.
Again, having all the drivers correctly time aligned, it just makes it. And again, it's these things that you think, why isn't nobody else doing this?
Well,
some of them might be built in.
A lot of them are, but they're not talking about it. So
as far as I understand, Amphion actually does this as part of their speaker design, it's not in their DSP. At least they say something like that about their products.
Yeah.
There are, coming back to the whole phase alignment thing, there are definitely some who do it, but it's, to be honest, I wouldn't be surprised if it's going to be the norm very soon, because it's a no-brainer.
I mean, I feel like every DSP speaker's been doing it for a while. It's just Head have decided to say, hey, look, you can have the option to have it on or off.
I'm not sure that they have, to be honest, because you do need to correct for that actively. Just because you're doing DSP or you have the ability of doing that type of filtering doesn't mean that you are actually doing it. So I'm not entirely certain that's the case.
Okay.
And in terms of that head, what do you like so much about the air motion transformer? Is it the fact that it is, because many people have said to me it's clean, it's really, really clean top end. Is that kind of the reason why you like it so much?
Yeah, nowadays, definitely. But I mean, if you listen to some of the old Adam speakers, I mean, they were rough. I mean, like a 10-year-old Adam design, it's
harsh.
It's harsh. Yeah, it's because they distorted a lot. Yeah, and I think that's one of the main things they fixed. And so now it just sounds extremely clean. It sounds very precise. It's very effortless. It's very non-fatiguing, which didn't used to be the case. It definitely wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago. I mean, I don't know. I can't really tell you, right? It's a tasting. I just really enjoy how it sounds, and it's very precise and it's fun. That's the thing. It's enjoyable on top of being revealing and really good for mixing. Like, it took me a good 6 months to get accustomed to them, but when I did, it's so much easier to mix on them now, right? I don't know. It's funny how the right tool does that, right? It's like a good hammer. If it's properly weighted, got the right weight distribution, blah 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 blah, and then you can hit that nail just right.
Yeah,
you know?
totally.
Some mixers require a hammer, so that's a good analogy. I think the last thing to summarize was to pick up from something we touched on earlier, talking about tuning, toning, and also there's a third T, which I think is tilting. Paul and I have definitely been on journeys in terms of having to adjust our natural tilts. Paul, if I'm not mistaken, you were bass heavy and top end light for a while.
Yeah,
was it Warren who pointed out and said, don't worry, leave it to the mastering? And you were like, no, I can't do that. I need control over this. So you tilted and then kind of pivoted and went the other way and then balanced in the middle. And I've done a similar thing where I had a big smiley face.
Yeah, you did, yeah.
Natural EQ from live sound, loads of bass and loads of top end, probably because I've played drums for too many years. So I had a big smiley face and then I went the other way and did that.
Yeah, you did.
And then hopefully somewhere now it's in the middle. So there's tuning one's self, tuning one's own tilt to what works for translation. Now, we all like, the haptics and being in a big club and getting bass pounded in your in your chest, causing cardiorhythmia and all that. But it doesn't always translate when you're hammering that out in mixes to other devices. So, yeah, tuning, toning, and tilting for me.
I suppose the last thing, probably the best way to wrap up would be, what would be if you were to say the main key advice for somebody starting out right now, like what would you say would be your main advice to get a system in this modern day that translates?
Well, again, it's those fundamentals. Get your listening position and your speaker setup right. And maybe just realize that if you're setting up your speakers in an untreated room, you can get good sound from them, but you have to be pretty close to them.
Mm-hmm.
The more the room is damped, the less the room contributes to the sound, the more you can get away with being further away from your speakers. Other way around, if you're in a completely untreated room, you have to be pretty close to the speakers. Or if you want a fairly unaltered sound, get close to your speakers. Get a stereo triangle that has where you're under a meter away from your speakers. Small speakers as well. Mm-hmm. KH120s, talking about Neumanns, we all hate the 310s, but the 120s are fantastic. Yeah.
Don't ask Ed.
So, for a small speaker, right?
Yeah.
The head type 05s are amazing. Yeah.
Even the iLouds. I've got the iLoud Micro Pros that they sent me last week. I love the iLouds. I think they're very forward and very phase coherent.
Okay.
But I think they would probably be a good shout because you can have them, relatively quite close to you in an untreated room.
They're made for that, right? I haven't listened to them myself, but they're made for that purpose. And just realize that you're not trying to impress anybody at this point with a kick-ass looking studio.
Yeah.
What you want is a reliable sound. So get in there, get your small, compact, but reliable stereo setup set up, and then just get on to working, right? And you can totally get a decent sound just by being pretty close to your speakers.
How beneficial are soffit mounted speakers?
Oof. Tough question. If you want the best response from a speaker, then you need to soffit mount it. But not all speakers are meant to be soffit mounted, so you can't just do that with any speaker. You might, if you're trying to do, because basically you have certain acoustic effects that are compensated for by default in a standard speaker design, because they're not meant to be put into the wall. And as soon as you put them into the wall, these acoustic effects drop away, but the speakers are still trying to compensate for that effect, and so now they're messed up. And so now you need to compensate for the compensation. Yeah. Long story short, it's tricky. But if you want the absolute best response from a speaker, then you need to soffit mount them. That said, there are so many compromises involved that I don't recommend it. Yeah, you're much better off having the flexibility and the ability to work with your speaker positioning and experiment with that, and you can get fixed. Yeah, you can get you can definitely get a good enough sound for anything that you'll ever do by not soffit mounting your speakers.
Interesting. On that bombshell, that has been another wonderful episode. Thank you, Jesco, for coming on and sharing your wisdom and knowledge on this. This fits perfectly into our season 7 set of interviews and speaker and room acoustic rabbit holes that Paul and I have been down. So thank you very much for your time. I've been Ed Thorne. We've had Jesco from Acoustics Insider. We will leave a link to his content below. And Paul Third's been up there in Scotland. It's been emotional. Thanks for listening.